All right, hello again. So in this video, we're going to be talking about Flexbox. So Flexbox is a set of CSS techniques, right? A set of CSS properties that we can use in order to lay out content in a way that's flexible and adaptable to different screen sizes and tends to work out really well and tends to just make a lot of sort of layout and structuring of our web pages easier. But yeah, so that's basically what we're going to do in this video. We're just going to basically cover Flexbox. When people say Flexbox, it feels like it should be really complex. It's actually not. There's no new syntax in this video. We're just going to be writing CSS properties, just like all the properties we've written before. We're going to learn some new properties that interact in slightly unique ways, but they're just properties. We're writing them out the same way, and it's actually less complex than you might think it's going to be. Okay, so what is a flexbox? Well, a flexbox is an element, right? It's just a normal HTML element. It's a way of describing a kind of element that allows you to flexibly customize the layout of the children of that element. So you can think of a flexbox, any element can be made into a flexbox. So you can think of like a div, right? Like a box on our screen. And by saying that this div, this element is going to be a flexbox, it means that the stuff that's inside of it, right, the elements that are its kids, we can customize how those elements get laid out. We can make any element, any block element really, I guess you could do it inline, but any block element into a flexbox by giving it the display flex CSS property. So we're going to add one property to an element, and that's going to change how its content is getting organized. Sort of here, my basic graphic example, right, is if you imagine you have a div that has a flexbox and it's got a bunch of paragraphs or a bunch of images or a bunch of other stuff inside of it, right? Those child elements, the stuff that's inside the flexbox, is what gets reorganized. The flexbox itself stays a block element. It takes up the same space on the page. It's just the stuff inside of it gets manipulated and moved around and changed a bit. All right, so in order to give a demo of sort of how this works, I have a web page that I'm going to sort of play around with. It's not library specific. I didn't kind of sort of put that together, but it's an example of like a personal homepage that you might make for yourself. In this case, the one I made for me. So I've got my name, I've got sort of a little about section, and then I've got a sort of set of cards or sort of elements, right, boxes that are going to represent the different courses that I've taught and the different courses that I teach regularly, along with little pictures to represent each one. If you look at the HTML of this, like what I have this section that is my courses section, and I have a bunch of divs inside of it that are cards, and that's what each of these black boxes represents, right? This is an outline I put on a card, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cards here. That's what's going on. Okay. So in order to make a flexbox, basically lets us be able to organize how these elements are going to get laid out together. So currently in my sort of example here, I have all of these divs, right, that are sort of, they're just normal divs, they're block elements. And because they're block elements, they're going to sit right on top of each other, right? So here's the first block, you can sort of hover over and see it, right? Here's the first block, there's the next block, there's the next block, right? They all sort of sitting right on top of each other. They take up the width of the page because they're block elements. Now, if I want to customize how those elements are laid out, right? I want these cards not to sit top to bottom, but instead just, I don't know, sit side by side, or I want to adjust where they go. What I could do is I could take all of those card elements and put them inside a Flexbox. That's the language that we use. We say, let's put these elements inside of a Flexbox. You can imagine like they normally get laid out this way, sort of on your desk, but you're going to put them inside of a special box, and in that box, you can customize and rearrange how you want these things to be positioned. All right, so if I need to make myself a box, right, to put these things in, a flex box, we're going to go ahead and create an element that's going to represent that. I'm basically going to create a new parent element that will have all these cards as its content. So for example, I'm going to make a new div, right, because it's going to have no semantic meaning. This is just going to be adding styling, right, organization work. And I'm going to call this the card deck, because that's what this class is, right? This div is going to be my collection of cards, so I'll call it my card deck. Why not? So again, here's my div, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just to make it clear, I'm going to indent these things a little bit to indicate that all of these cards are now children of this card deck, right? So all I've done here is I haven't changed any of my appearance of anything. I've just gone ahead and I've added sort of a new element that's going to contain and hold all these other kids. Notice that the page doesn't change its appearance, but now inside of my courses section, I now have this div, right, this card deck, which can be my box. And inside my box, I can have a bunch of cards that are floating around inside of it. And again, because it's a div, because these things are all divs, they're normally going to sit top to bottom. So if we want to then change how that works, we can then start adding some, we can turn this card deck element that we created into a Flexbox. And when we say we're going to turn that element into a Flexbox, what that really means, and here I'm going to go down to my courses section here, is we're gonna style that element. So I'm going to be using my my class selector to say we're going to style the card deck, and I'm going to give this deck a display property of flex. Now we've previously used the display property to switch between whether something is a block element or an inline element. In this case, we're going to sort of also be using the display property to change whether that element is considered a Flexbox or not. The trick here, the piece that gets confusing about this is that while previously we've used display to say the card deck itself is either going to be block or it's going to be inline, or it's going to go a long way. We're going to sort of change how this sort of card deck itself is getting sort of understood, laid out on the page. When we give something a display of flex, we're not actually changing the card deck itself, right? The card deck remains a block element. It's going to fill up the width of the page, and it's going to have stuff goes above it and below it, just like every other block element we've ever looked at. Making something into a Flexbox doesn't change the element style or the element display type. It stays a box element, a block element. But what giving something the display flex does is it changes how the contents inside of it are going to get organized and get rendered. So by adding one property, I've simply said, let's make this card deck into a Flexbox, by which I mean, let's give it a display of flex, which says, hey, you kids, these cards inside of me, you should not be organized in your normal way. You should be organized according to Flexbox rules. When we do that, if I then refresh my page, you'll notice that suddenly all my cards now sit side by side next to each other. So what will happen here is that when you make it into a Flexbox, by default, all of the cards inside of it will now no longer be laid out top to bottom like block elements where they take up the sort of the width of the page. Instead, they're all going to be sitting side by side, kind of like inline elements, right? But they're not considered inline. They're still each one of these is still considered a block element. It's just that we're basically saying don't follow your normal block element rules where you go one on top of each other. Instead, because you're in a Flexbox, you're going to follow Flexbox rules, right? We've sort of entered into this special zoned box. And in the Flexbox rules, our elements are going to sit side by side by default. Again, we can customize this. We can be more flexible about it. But by default, they're going to sit side by side. You'll notice that each box is taking up exactly as much room as it needs to fill its content. So most of these are getting squeezed a bit because this is how, like, it can't get any smaller than that image because that image is like constraining its size. And then some of the words are sort of holding it together. But you'll notice that a couple of these things, like because the words end up being a little bit long in order to get wrapped together, that makes those boxes be a little bit bigger. You'll also notice that when something is inside of Flexbox, all these boxes, right, they're sized to be as wide as their content requires them to be, and they'll all be the same height. Right, so even though this one had some extra white space here because this image is a little bit smaller, it still ends up being the same height as all the other elements. And you can see that by looking at sort of our individual elements and see where these pieces are. So again, the reason there's some white space here is because it's padding, but this guy has, margin, but this one has its margin, but then the element itself is bigger than that. If we shrink the window a bit, right, if we get to the point where we're too small, you see how it starts squeezing together. Right, if my window is really small, my images, again, need to be big enough to fit. The images won't shrink to sort of squeeze into the box. The images say, like, they're fixed at 100 pixels. That's basically as small as they can get, roughly. And so the elements of the inside the Flexbox won't get any smaller than that, and then the Flexbox ends up sort of just increasing and goes as big as it has, potentially over the length of the page. Okay, so that's our Flexbox, right? That's our basic idea. And again, you can see that, like, depending on how I've got my text wrapping here, right? Like, if there's enough room on the page that it can squeeze everything in, it will. But if there's not quite enough room, you'll notice that, like, my two programming wraps on different lines. And so again, it sort of shifts around how things look. So Flexbox will do its best to sort of squeeze all these boxes next to each other. It's shrinking, sort of squeezing the text as it needs to, but it'll also expand them out sort of in a fairly even way in order to sort of support for larger browsers. If my browser was much wider, then again, it like lays them out in ways that are kind of equal, but this one's a little bit longer because again, these words end up being a little bit longer. All right, so that's the basic, that's the most fundamental change that a Flexbox give, right? Is that when you create an element and turn that element into a Flexbox, all the elements that are inside of that element, right? Inside of that box, instead of being laid out top to bottom as block elements, will get laid out side to side, almost like they were inline elements. That's the fundamental change that Flexbox does, right? It changes how the contents inside of it are going to get organized. All right, so that's the basic idea. That said, once we've got a Flexbox, we're then able to further customize how these elements get laid out, right? By default, do I have know about this? No. I used to have, I thought it was my slides. By default, so they're all going to go next to each other and then sort of shrink to fit with the equal heights, but we can start adjusting those properties and adjusting that changes by using some additional properties. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our Flexbox, right? Remember this thing here, this is the Flexbox, and you know that it's a Flexbox because it has display flex. When I give an element display flex, that says you are now a Flexbox. You're also a block element. You're also a div, right? You're this other thing. You're this thing you've been before, but now you've also gained the special property where you're now a Flexbox, which means that your kids get laid out in their own particular way. So what we can do is we can go to the Flexbox itself, right? Not the elements inside of it, but the Flexbox itself. And I can give them additional properties in order to indicate how I want those children, those cards, to get laid out within this box, right? We sort of said, okay, here's the box where I'm going to organize these pieces. We can now specify how we want to organize them. So there's a couple of properties we can use. I'm going to go over the two most common ones, I think most useful ones, is we can give this a property called flex wrap, which gains a value of wrap. If we don't want to wrap, we would just not give the property, right? So basically saying, how do we want these things to wrap around? And we can say that, yes, we'd like them to wrap around. This is similar to how text wraps around, right? You'll notice that like my text here is when I get to the end of this line, it wraps around to the next, right? We swing around. It's like what word processors do. What we can do is we can specify that I want my elements to be sort of as big as they need to be to fit their content. But instead of getting all squeezed together to sort of squeeze everything in one line, we could say that if it's too long for the line, just like we would use with our wording up here, we can say let's wrap around below. All right, so if I add in flex wrap and I hit refresh, you'll notice that now what happens is that these cards are now going to be as big as they need to be for their text to kind of fit nicely, which I mean, the text doesn't need to wrap itself. So you'll notice that this box is just big enough for the text to run around it. This one is just big enough for the text to run around it. So is this one, right? This is how big that needs to be. But because these two class names are relatively short, right? They're just happen to be slightly shorter names. It means that there's now enough room for both boxes to be sitting next to each other. So because there's enough white space over here, these boxes will sit next to each other, just like if there were enough room for multiple words on the line, those words would be on the same line. If I squeeze this font a little bit smaller, let's just play it just for a moment. I'm going to just make the font much smaller. You could way smaller, right? You can now see that what's happening is that like there's enough room to put 3 boxes on the side, but there's not enough for a 4th box. So that 4th box wraps around to the next line, just like it would with Word. Again, these boxes are still remain all the same height. They're gaining only as much width as they need. When we say something is going to wrap, it's going to basically wrap around. And if there's extra white space, there's extra white space, and that's fine. Maybe I can make this like a little bit larger, so it's not quite that horrifying. There we go. That feels pretty good. This is not saying this looks good. Please don't use tiny font size like this. I'm just trying to be able to demonstrate how these things come together. Great. So there's our property. That's our flex wrapping property. And this is a good thing to do is often if you want to have these bunch of flex items, like you want to have a bunch of cards, you want to have a bunch of columns, you want to have a bunch of elements, often you want them to sort of be like, well, when there's not enough room, don't squeeze them all together. Instead, just have them wrap around to the next line. The same thing happens with our text, right? When we run out of room on the page, we wrap around to the next line. We don't try to squeeze the text and make it smaller to fit. So that's the text wrap property. The other property that's then useful is we can use what's called the justify content property. And again, we're going to do this by modifying the Flexbox itself. So where we go. My Flexbox is currently saying, all right, don't display its kids by normal top to bottom. Instead, lay them out in a row, like a Flexbox row, and then wrap them around if they get too long. But because I've now got all this extra white space here, right? I've got this extra white space here, which if you in the developer tools, if you select the Flexbox itself, it'll show you where the, let me see if I can get it to show up. Turn that off, do this. No, all right. I can't really point with the mouse, but you can see that where the where each individual box element is, where each child element is being drawn with a dotted purple line. You can sort of see them right along this black line here. And then there's this sort of dash purple area is the other space that's part of the Flexbox, right? It's inside that Flexbox, but it's not currently being occupied by any elements. It's like extra empty ocean, right? It's empty white space that's sort of just being not used by anything else. When we go to say we want something to start wrapping, that's going to potentially leave some of this empty white space because of how things need to wrap. So once we have this empty white space, we can say what we want to do with it. Maybe I want to specify how these elements are going to sit inside of that empty white space. And I can do that by using the justify content property. So again, we're going to customize our card deck, our Flexbox, to say, okay, here's the content inside of you. I want them to wrap. They're going to normally sit side by side, but they're going to wrap. And here's how I want you to sort of justify them within their margins. You've probably seen text justification in Word or in a word processor, right? We talk about like left aligned, right aligned, justified, where like it spreads out the text to try to make it like, you know, create like nice columns and not be raggedy edges. The same concept here in terms of justifying content is occurring, right? The question is not how much we're going to lay out the words, it's how we're going to lay out the elements inside the Flexbox, right? The individual cards. So for example, I could give these things a justify content of center, which will then center all the elements inside of that Flexbox. So it'll, inside of that big purple area, you can't see me pointing, right? But inside this big purple area, we're going to center all of those cards. So I do that, let me refresh. Ta-da! Now you can see that inside of that those purple areas, right, my cards have now been centered. And that means we've justified them, right? There's different values we can give to our justify content. We can do a flex start, which sort of is the left aligned, flex end, which is right aligned. We call it start and end because technically it works also if you're going top to bottom, not left to right. We've got different options here. We talked about centering. I'm often a really big fan of space between. Space between is going to make sure that there is an even amount of space between each element. So if I refresh my page, you'll now see that there's an equal amount of space between these elements. If I make my text a little bit smaller, back to the point where we can get 3 in a row, right? You'll now see that I've got my 3 cards and there's an equal amount of space between these things. Right? I've said make an equal amount of space between my cards, but it does shove them up all the way up against the sides of the walls. If we instead say that we want an equal amount of space around, using the space around value for justify content, then what that'll do is that'll make sure there's an equal amount of space sort of around each card, almost like it's creating an amount of padding here. So if we look at our card deck, that's not really helping, but so there's like, it's easier to see on this bottom line where I've got sort of this amount of space, right? About, you know, whatever, 1 finger's worth. I've got that much on the far side, that much on the same amount on this far side, and then in between, I've got sort of that equal amounts of those space. So I've got sort of twice of that in the middle. Similarly, I've got a tiny little space here, tiny little space there, and I've got twice of that between these two things. So the space around, it does a nice job of kind of centering, but also not making everything like seem like it's squished into the center. Space between will sort of like make sure that things are kind of like evenly organized, but they sort of go up against the sides. And you can really sort of adjust how you want this to look based on what you're how you want these things to lay out. But as you'll notice, it's a pretty easy set of changes, right? I can sort of adjust how I want these things to be sort of organized. Do I want them to be centered? Do I want them to have space between them? And I can get these effects by changing just one property. So the Flexbox basically lets us customize how that works. And here's how we can say, well, here's how we want our generic spacing between things. If I want to add additional spacing in places, I can also use things like margin and padding, right? Notice that none of these boxes, where'd my boxes go? None of these cards actually have margin or padding involved. If I go ahead and give them some padding, or give them some margin, like margin on the left, 20em, then what you can see that then happens is that my cards gain their margin, and that kind of takes up part of the spacing between them, right? So like the sort of space, it's like the bottom ones, right? That's kind of modifying like sort of how they've gotten shoved over the side a little bit. Often with Flexbox, you actually don't want to use margins between elements. You really want the Flexbox to be sort of organizing where these things are, because margins are going to sort of shove things off in kind of awkward ways. Okay, there's a couple other properties we can use as well for displaying Flexboxes, but these are the two big ones. They're the most common ways you're going to actually like lay out any kind of content on the page, right? You're going to have your elements in the Flexbox. You're going to have them wrap, and then you want to be able to have them sort of justify how much space is between them. Okay, so that's our basic examples of things we can apply to the Flexbox. Now, in addition to the rules and properties we can apply to the Flexbox, right? This is to the box itself. I think of it like almost like a pool, right? It's like this area, the special zone. Here's the rules we're applying that special zone. We're saying that here it is a special zone. It's a flex zone. It has wrapping, and inside the zone, the content wraps around, and inside the zone, the content is justified. In addition, it's also possible to customize the elements that are inside the Flexbox itself. So you're not customizing the zone, right? The box itself. Instead, you're customizing the things that are inside of it. One metaphor that works pretty well is if you think of this almost like a classroom or like a theater or like a arena, a place that has sort of seating set up. A Flexbox is a way of saying, well, here's how I want to organize the seats, right? I don't want my seats to go sort of normal top to bottom like block elements do. Instead, I want them to go side by side. I can say I want to justify the space between them in order to sort of organize where those seats go. This specifies where I want my seats to be. What we can then do to the children is we can have the children indicate how much space they want to take up within their parent, right? Within that pool, within that box. Effectively, it's almost like if you're going to say, here's how I've laid out my chairs in my classroom, but when someone comes to sit down in the classroom, how many chairs are they going to take up? Right? Are they sitting in the chair and putting their backpack next to them? So they're taking up 2 chairs. How much extra space do we want them to take up? So one way that we can do that we can sort of justify how much space we want these things to take up, and I'll just do it the small so we can see it, is that we can apply a property to the individual cards called, where is it? Called flex grow, which is going to indicate how we want that element to grow if there's extra space. So it's almost like they're sitting down and there's a couple empty seats next to it, right? Again, we've got this big like empty sea, sort of open ocean, like sort of unoccupied space. We can say I want this element to grow to fill that unoccupied space in some way. So what we do is we can assign that to an individual element that's inside the Flexbox. So I think I can grab, let me go ahead and let me give this a quick class. This is going to be the info 340 card. I'm just giving a quick class so we can be able to refer to it. If I go to then my info 340 card, right? Again, I'm writing a selector. It's going to select things that are card and info 340. I can give it a flex grow of 1. Now, we're not giving it a pixels or a width or percentage. We're basically giving it a share. So we're saying that this card should gain 1 share of whatever extra space there is. Everyone else, because we haven't specified, gets no shares. But because it's the only card we've said to grow, he's going to grow and fill up all the empty seats and take all the empty space he can. Which, and when we refresh the page, we can see that he does. Right? He spreads out to fill that empty white space. Right? That you remember we used to have that empty ocean. Yeah, let me comment it out. Right? Notice that again we have this empty ocean in that first row right before we've wrapped. When we say no, I want the 340 card, this first guy, to go ahead and he should fill in that empty ocean. We can do something similar to like we go to this LIS, the LIS 511 class. Probably don't have LIS 549 in this example. LIS 549, and we can give him a flex grow of 1 as well. Oh, sorry, forgot my colon. Oh my gosh, sorry, 511. There we go. And then again, he will grow to fill up all the empty space on his row. So these elements are staying as big as they wanted to be, but now all that empty ocean, this person basically comes in, he sits down on the chairs and says, man, all these chairs next to me are empty. I'm going to go ahead and just spread out and take up that room. Right? We've let that thing grow by that equal amount. Now, the trick here is, and I apologize again that I didn't have the search set together. Info 48. Right. if we go ahead and created multiple ones of these cards, so if we said the card, this, for example, this info 448 card, this the Android card, I can give him a flex grow of a bigger number. Let's give him a flex grow of like 2, for example. Now, what's going to happen is that's going to say that out of the empty space, the LIS 511 gets 1 share of it, and the LIS, the info 448 card, gets 2 shares of it. So out of all the space, right, you get 2 and you get 1, sort of the ratio between them. Shares is really the right way to think of it. If you think of like stock shares type of things. If you've done cooking, I think of this as like parts, right? This is almost like if you're mixing drinks, right? This is like 1 part LIS 511, 2 parts 448, and like that's the ratio you need to have between them. So if we do that, then what you'll notice that happens is that the LIS 511 gains a little bit of extra space, right? It gains this much extra space, but the 448 class gains twice of that much amount of empty space. So what we're able to do is we're able to say that, yeah, both of you should take up some empty space, but you get twice as much as you do. Because again, that's the ratio between these two things, right? It's a 2-to-1 ratio. So that's a pretty common way of being able to sort of structure and sort of specify that I want these things to spread out. Now you'll notice that when I have my flex grow, suddenly my justify content doesn't really matter anymore because I don't need to talk about the space around, because currently I've had everything grow, so there is no empty space, so it doesn't matter where we're sitting up, right? You're like, my seats are now spread out the whole way through because I've said to grow out that much. What we can then do, of course, is if I stop customizing the individual cards, we could, for example, say I want all the cards to have a flex grow of 1. I want them all to grow in equal amounts. And then you get this nice kind of effect where all the cards grow like kind of an equal amount, so they all stay relatively similar in size, except, you know, again, this one's bigger card, so it grows a little bit more. And you'll be able to fill our content and create this kind of nice gridding kind of behavior with our Flexbox. If I made my font size went back up a little bit bigger, so that we have that, right? Then I get that same kind of behavior where these two guys are growing, but they're still filling up the whole space. These two are growing, and then this one, of course, is on itself, so it grows to fill up the whole place. And I get in this nice kind of gridded style system. If I wanted this guy to stop growing, I could, for example, give him a special rule that says don't grow, and then he would sort of stay in his own side, and then I could have things like the justify content rules apply to him. So flex grow is one of the most common properties to use with the Flexbox, because again, it lets me say that even though I've now organized how these things are laid out next to each other, the flex grow property says how much extra space do you want to take up? How much extra space should that room allow? There's a couple other rules you can apply to individual cards. There is a flex shrink that basically says that if there's not enough space, right, if our screen is too narrow, who should get cut off first, right? Who should shrink faster? We don't use that very often because generally you're going to say start things small and have them grow to fill space, as opposed to trying to say like start big and try to get squeezed down. That has made design worse. So flex grow is kind of the main property that gets used most of the time. Okay. So that's our flex grow property. So there's a bunch of properties that can be, again, applied to elements and to the Flexbox and to the children itself. The key here, and the thing that I think confuses students the most when they're learning Flexbox, is getting mixed up between the Flexbox itself, right? This big box, this big container, right? Again, that was my card deck, right? That big that block element that had all this purple white space in the middle, purple space in the middle of it. That's the flex box, right? And that's sometimes called a flex container. It's sometimes called the flex parent, but it's kind of, it gives different names, but that's the flex box itself. Don't get that mixed up with the child elements, right? The things that are inside the flex box, right? Those are my cards, right? This is my flex box. These are the children, the things that are inside of the flex box. They're sometimes called the flex items, which again is confusing because the flex box is not a flex item. The flex box contains flex items. It's a flex container, contains flex items. But the idea here is just to keep track of those are two different things. You want to start by thinking, okay, let me make something into a flex box, giving it display flex, and then I can customize that flex box by giving it wrapping and justifying. If I then need to change how big the elements are, I can then customize the individual elements themselves. So the flex grow property goes on the individual elements, the children, the cards, while my wrapping and justifying goes on the box itself, goes on the flex container itself. So again, think about this is that the Flexbox says, how do the stuff inside of me get laid out, right? How do I want to organize the seats in my classroom, like the chairs in my classroom? And then the children elements specify how many seats do they want to take up, right? How big am I, given that this is the organization, this is the layout that we're going to use. And that's the basics idea of Flexbox. As I said, there's a number of other properties that you can apply to Flexbox. The best way to look out and figure out what kinds of things you can do to Flexbox, the best resource for this, which is linked from the course readings as well, is the CSS Tricks Complete Guide to Flexbox. CSS Tricks is a lovely website that contains a lot of CSS tricks. It's a good place to look up, like, how do I achieve a particular effect? It's a good place that has a bunch of tutorials and documentations for how to do those kinds of things. And they include my very favorite guide to Flexbox, which, again, is getting old now, but it's like the best one I've ever seen because it has pictures. It's very, very visual. So what it does, it'll basically tell you, like, here's the basic idea where I've got my Flex container, my Flex box, and I've got my kids, right? The container is purple, the kids are orange. And then it tells you all the different things you can do to your Flexbox. You can change the direction, so you can have them go top to bottom or left to right, right? You can have it go like this way, that way, up, down, in terms of how you want these elements to be laid out. Do you want them laid out side by side, or do you want them to be laid out top to bottom, like normal, or do you want them laid out bottom to top? You can do that. You can organize, we talked about wrapping. You can specify how they want to get justified. And again, it shows you pictures. So if you want to know what does it look like, you just look at the picture and it tells you what it's going to look like overall. It's got options where we can specify how we want them to be aligned, sort of like, while justification says like how we want them to be like sort of organized in their row. Alignment wants to talk about how we want them to be sort of top to bottom. So we talk about sort of type alignment of there. You can talk about how we want to align the overall content itself. And again, there's pictures that indicate how you want these things to come together. Similarly, on the other column here, if you want to know what kinds of things we can do to children, we can modify their order. So you can actually change which element comes first just by using the Flexbox proper rules to basically say, no, out of these cards, this one should always go at the end. We talked about flex growing, there's flex shrinking, basis is sort of your default size, and some shortcuts and then alignments as well. So again, there's lots of different options we can use for Flexbox. If you ever get stuck or you need help remembering what were those properties, what were those options, CSS Tricks Guide to Flexbox, really the best resource, my favorite resource. I go pull this all the time to be able to say, if I forget how Flexbox stuff works, this is where I go back to sort of look those pieces up. Okay, there's one or two more things I want to talk about for Flexbox, just to be clarified how these work. The first is the idea that you can actually nest Flexboxes. So a Flexbox can contain other Flexboxes inside of it, by which I mean that if this thing here is a Flexbox, we can make the elements inside of them also be Flexboxes, right? So this is basically going to think of this as like a classroom, and then on each seat in the classroom, there is in fact another tiny little model classroom that can have its own content laid out in that way. So for example, currently my images here in my div, right? I've got my image and I've got my H3. These are basically block elements. But if I want to make those things into a Flexbox, I can do that. I can say, let's take this 340 card and let's give it a display flex. And that'll now say, great, we're going to basically take these things that used to be block elements, so they go top to bottom. And now we've said, let's put them side by side, go left to right. And of course, once we do that, now there's not enough room for us to put two things side by side. So this sort of the whole line wraps. So now we have this thing here. That's a Flexbox. Let me get rid of the grow and that'll help you see a little bit. Right. Let me get rid of this too. All right. So here's my Flexbox, right? You can see the big purple area. That's the Flexbox itself. Right? That's the classroom. It's got chairs inside of it. Here's one chair inside of that, right? That's a box. That's sort of a thing, like a little, think of it like a cardboard box that's floating around inside of this bigger cardboard box. Inside of my 340 box here, right? That's a Flexbox. So it's then got a set of content inside of it. If I give this thing a flex grow, oh, not you. If I give you a flex grow, I think I can make it do that. There we go. We can actually see that this Flexbox now, right? This card deck, this card inside of it has itself its own set of white space, right? It fills that entire span, but then its content takes up only that much room and then that much room, and then it leaves this other empty purple white space that's kind of available inside of that box. So the way you can really think about this is, again, I kind of really think about this literally like cardboard boxes, right? Here's my Flexbox zone, and here's how I want to lay those things out inside the zone. the things that I'm laying out inside of it are themselves their own divs. They're their own cardboard boxes, right? So I got one box inside of a bigger box. And if you've done any kind of organizational stuff, that's normal, right? Boxes inside of boxes. So I've got my big box and I've got a little box inside of it. That little box inside of it can also be a flex box that's indicate how it wants to organize the stuff that's inside of it. And that's okay. That's really normal. We actually do that quite often, right? This is how I can be able to do things like to get stuff to sort of get sized or filled or sort of structured the way I want. If I want to be able to say I want this sort of thing, this image to be centered, if I want some things to be doing that, I can use sort of my justifying content to do that kind of work. The key that I think, again, the students get confused about this is that you need to remember that a Flexbox only influences the layout of its kids. It actually doesn't care about the grandkids or the parents at all, right? So this Flexbox here, right, this thing is a Flexbox. It says I have some divs inside of me. It doesn't care what those divs look like, how those divs are organized. It doesn't care if those divs are themselves Flexbox, if those divs contain images or paragraphs. It has no idea. It doesn't care. This card deck says, I need to lay out my divs. I'm going to put my divs, my child boxes, organized in a line like that. If those child boxes decide they also want to organize things according to Flexbox rules, that's their business, right? A Flexbox only cares about how its kids are getting organized. It doesn't care about the grandkids or the great-grandkids. It doesn't care about anything further down the tree. Similarly, this div, right, this card deck is just a block element, which means it's going to sit immediately below this other block element, and it'll sit immediately above some other block element, like another paragraph. These are fun. Right? The fact that this is a Flexbox doesn't change the fact that it's a big block. It's a big div, just like every div you've ever worked on. The Flexbox just changes how the stuff inside of that is getting modified. Right. So in this case, like there's my next line, my next paragraph. It comes after my div. Right. There's the first one. There's my div. There's my paragraph. Just like everything we've done so far. Nothing has changed. All Flexbox has done is said it inside of this element. Let's organize and not put our kids top to bottom, but instead put them sort of side by side and then customize that as we go. So I think that's the kind of thing we can do. Okay, so when do we use these kinds of Flexboxes for? So Flexboxes are great for all kinds of things. They're great for centering block elements. We've previously in examples have used things like trying to customize like auto margins and fix sizes. That works okay. But if you want to center some content, a Flexbox is a really great solution for that, right? If I wanted to center all these cards, right? If I wanted my cards to be centered in some way, I could do that, right? I just give them a justify content of center. And ta-da, all my cards are now centered. If I want them to be sort of blocked out one by one, take up some amount of space, that's fine. I could do that, right? I can give these things some sizing. We could, for example, give them a flex grow. Well, we can give it, for example, a flex basis of like 50%. So each one's going to take up half the page. Flex basis is a little bit like specifying it's starting with before you grow anything. So we can have each thing take up half the page, right? And look, now we've got this nice like centered set of content. So I didn't need to specify and mess with margins. I didn't need to mess with sort of widths. I mean, I messed with width a little bit, but mostly I just said, hey, I want this thing to be centered, put it inside of a content. If I want this paragraph, if I want, what's a good one? If I want like this head, I need like a block element. Well, fine, we'll do it. Like if I want this heading, like this H1 to be centered, like I could center the text, but if I want the actual element itself to be centered, then what I can do, like here, let me fix this a bit. What I can do is I can say I want that H1 to be centered. So let's go ahead and let's take the element that's inside the header and make that into a Flexbox, which then says this element here, instead of sitting like sort of following normal layout rules where it takes up the whole page, instead we're going to have it sort of sit side by side. So I can go ahead, like let's go ahead, we'll give H1 a background color. That's gray, just so we can see it. All right, great. So there's my, okay, that was hard to see, read. Can I use a light gray? Yeah, a little bit better. If I then say, let's go ahead and make my header into a Flexbox, Flexbox by giving it again display flex. then what happens is that now my H1, my block element, only takes up as much space as the content needs. You can see that where its outline is. And then now it's sitting on sort of side by side by itself, right, with a bunch of empty white space next to it. If I then give you a justify content of center, and ta-da, I've now centered that block element. And if I want this block element to be bigger, I can, of course, add more padding to it. Like I can then customize its size and appearance, but the block element itself has now been centered. I centered it by putting that block element inside of a Flexbox. In this case, I already had the header to work with, but I could have always added another div, similar to how we added a card deck to say, here's the Flexbox that's going to organize how these kids inside of it are going to get laid out. So it's really good for centering block elements. Flexboxes are really good for making columns on a web page. So for example, I have my two different sections here, right? I've got my About Me section and my Courses I Teach section. Right, so these are both inside my main, right? I've got two sections. If I want those sections to be laid out not top to bottom, right, where I have section 1 About on top of section Courses, if I want them to be laid out side by side, I could go ahead and take this main and say, let's turn that main into a Flexbox. So let's again, its children will not be laid out top to bottom, but will be laid out next to each other. So if I do that, all right, if I go ahead and let's take my main and give it a display flex. Now my two elements are laid out side by side. I've created two different columns. And then of course I can start adjusting them. If I want my About section to be like maybe only 30% of the page width, I can give it a flex base of 30%. Right now it's sort of skinnier. Right now I've got sort of a skinny sidebar on the About Me section. If I want to, of course, have that come afterwards, I can use that ordering property. I can actually change its order 1 so that I can actually have it be sitting over there on the right. And look, now I've made sort of two different columns of content, right? I've created a multi-column layout, which is kind of a big thing in design. And I did it just by giving an element a display of flex, right? Just by saying, let's make these two things that normally would be top to bottom. Because I want them to be side to side, I'm just going to put them both inside of a Flexbox, and the Flexbox says now make them lay out side to side. So often when you're thinking about developing columns, what you really do is you design all your HTML and really all your styling as if I'm going to have column 1 sitting on top of column 2, and then you just throw them into a Flexbox, and now they sit side by side, and you're done. And it makes that done by adding like literally one property. It's not a lot of work. It doesn't add a lot of complexity, and now that's going to sort of work across lots of browsers, and it's going to work sort of without having to do a bunch of customization. But you have as much customization as you want. Flexboxes are great for making elements grow to fill spaces larger than its content. We talked about how we could, for example, make these things grow to fill their spaces. We can do a similar kind of thing, like if, for example, if I want this element to sort of, you can see how this gray space sort of skims all the way down to the bottom. That's the sort of the Flexbox specifying how these things grow. So again, we can often use Flexboxes to do things like make stuff fill greater amounts of spaces by using this flex growing property. Things that Flexboxes are not good solutions for, things you want to avoid using them for, is if you have a bunch of block elements that you want to stack on top of each other, just make them block elements that stack on top of each other, right? That's the browser's normal behavior. You don't need Flexboxes. You can have a lot of really good layouts without doing any kind of Flexbox work. And that's fine. So as you're developing a page, don't think, oh my gosh, I need to add a Flexbox in here to make it do something. The answer is, and this is often the answer with CSS, is it's possible you can achieve the effect you want without doing any Flexbox work. Just make your divs sit on top of each other, and then you're done. Flexboxes are not complex, but they also do add some other like layout stuff you have to keep an eye out on. They're not always necessary. So think through, like, just take a brief second before you say, oh, I need to have a Flexbox here, to think, do I actually want to have these elements sitting side by side? And if I do, is that because they're block elements, or should they maybe just be inline elements? Or do I actually want them to be side by side? We can make more complex layouts by, again, doing nesting kind of works, right? That's how you can be able to do things like where you can have elements laid out inside of other elements. So again, think of this almost like you're trying to lay out containers inside of containers. That's how you can sort of make out these kind of grid kinds of effects. Flexboxes are not great for just adding spacing between elements. If you want like generic spacing, like justifying level kind of spacing, like again, centered or justified content, Flexboxes are good for that. But if you want to be like, well, I just need to put a little bit of extra space between these two elements, don't think you want to put them in a Flexbox and try to have that spread them out. Like you can just use margin and padding, right? We have these other techniques and we can kind of sort of combine and mix and match these things sort of which feels like the simplest approach. Do the one that feels simplest, right? If something seems like, man, I feel like I should do that because it's complex, the answer is probably no, you shouldn't actually do it because it's complex. Do the one that's simple and that'll actually work better. But yeah, really anything the browser does by default, anything that's covered by more simple rules or more simple procedures we've talked about, don't use a Flexbox to do that, right? Don't try to make things more complex than they actually need to be. But again, they're really good for doing some kind of centering work. They're really good for columns. They're good for basically making some kinds of adjustments to make things sort of look good on a page and to produce sort of nice, flexible layouts that are going to work well across lots of different browsers. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind Flexbox, right? That's sort of, again, the basic of what this thing is going to look like. Sort of scroll down for this is the thing to look at. So this is the Flexbox is sort of a two-dimensional, one-dimensional layout, right? It's basically laying things out in a row. Even if they wrap around to the next one, they're still laying out in a row. There is a similar set of properties for what are called grids, which are using a display of grid that basically lets you not lay out things like they just go in a line, but you actually specify sort of they're sort of row and column, almost like within a table-ish kind of layout. Grids are more complex than Flexbox, but depending on what you're trying to lay out, they could be a good solution for that, though often you can just achieve the exact same effects by just making Flexboxes that have Flexboxes inside of them, right? I achieve this nice layout here. Let me fix this one. What did I do to make you so big? Oh, I made you a Flexbox. I made this guy a Flexbox. Right. Right, like I've gotten this nice, that look weird. Like I've got this nice kind of grid system, right, where I've got my sort of cards laid out in a line because they're a Flexbox, but I also have columns because I've got a Flexbox inside of a Flexbox, right? So you can often create complex layouts by nesting Flexboxes together, but grids can let you achieve a similar kind of effect sometimes. You'll practice with some both for assignments and exercises for this class. Okay, that's the basic idea by Flexbox. Again, the things to remember: the Flexbox itself is the container, right? That's my big box. That's my seats in my auditorium. That's my seats in my classroom. And then we have the Flex items, the children, that can then be laid out and figure out how much space those elements are going to take up. Flexboxes only look at their kids. They don't look at their grandkids. As long as you keep those ideas in mind, you'll understand and you'll do just fine working with Flexboxes to manage your web pages.